Hello, I'm Rich Hammar, legal counsel for the General Counsel of the Assemblies of God, and I'm joined today by Jerry Sparks, president of AG Financial Insurance Solutions. This is a special edition of Risk Management Live, and we're going to focus on an issue of significance to many of you, and that's church planting ministries. And we want to talk initially about the issue, Jerry, of when should church planting ministries be concerned about insurance coverages?
That's a great question, and I would tell you that with a church plant ministry, what they need to do is once they actually become incorporated or have their first meeting, if they're meeting in a house, they are probably coming under someone else's leadership. So if a church is planting them or if a district is planting them, a lot of times the district or the other church will actually give them insurance until they become their own organization. Once they become their own organization or they start meeting in a facility where they become a legal entity, that's when they need to get insurance.
And Jerry, isn't it important, this issue of when the insurance coverage accrues?
Yeah, and actually what I would tell you is that once they become a legal entity, so once they get incorporated or become an LLC, when they become that legal entity, that is really you want to make sure that you have your insurance in place by then. If the church plant or the district that is helping start the church, they should have the insurance. But somebody should have insurance when you really start your operation, because even if you're meeting in somebody's home, if something happens at that home, you want to make sure that insurance is happening.
And something can happen at that home.
Absolutely.
There have been a number of cases we've been involved with in home ministries. Okay, well, what type of coverages should a church plant acquire?
That's a great question. A lot of times church plants do not have a building themselves. They're going to be leasing somebody's building or operating in somebody's building, operating in a house, a movie theater, a retail place. So what they need to look at having is they need to have inland marine coverage because they probably don't own a building. Inland marine coverage will actually cover the equipment that is going normally from one place to another. So a lot of times you have to set up and take down. And you're bringing in your own maybe music, sound equipment, music instruments, chairs. A lot of the times you're bringing in a lot of that stuff with a trailer. And you want to make sure that you have that under an inland marine form because a property form will not cover it except for the location that you have for the property. Under inland marine, what it does is it covers that equipment no matter where it's located. So it can, if you're meeting in one or two different locations, it doesn't make any difference because you have inland and marine means that it's staying inland, and a marine means that it's covered no matter where it's located. So that's number one on the property coverage. Number two, they want to make sure that they have general liability. General liability covers bodily injury and property damage that may occur as you're held liable. So if the church causes a bodily injury, we have somebody slip and fall on the premises, we have something happen at the church where somebody is injured, we want to make sure that we have liability to cover the church to protect them in case they are sued by this.
Well, here's another good question, Jerry. What limits of liability should a church plant have?
Well, I would actually tell you that they should have a minimum coverage of $1 million for general liability. I would actually tell you that they should have a $1 million limit for hired and non-owned auto if they don't own any automobiles. So let me just talk about hired and non-owned auto. A lot of people say, well, I don't have an owned automobile because we're a church plant. But they may have people running errands for them to the post office, to the bank. If one of those people causes an accident, even if they're driving their own car, the church can be held responsible because they were on the church's time. So you want to make sure that you have hired and non-owned automobile coverage in case this happens. One of the largest cases that I've had, and I've actually been in the insurance business for over 30 years, was a secretary taking the deposit to the bank. And she just happened to hit an attorney driving a Mercedes, and his wife was actually a neurosurgeon, and she broke her hand. It was $1 million claim, and the person that they had running to the bank had the minimum state coverage limits of $10,000, bodily injury, and I think it was $10,000 also for or property damage. Well, the Mercedes costs more than $10,000, and the bodily injury costs much more than $10,000. So that's a coverage that I don't even ask people about whether they want it or not. It's an automatic. One of the next things is sexual misconduct coverage. Most churches do not even think about sexual misconduct coverage. Isn't that included in the general liability? And the answer is, it used to be back in the 80s. But when everything happened with the Catholic Church, insurance companies started excluding sexual misconduct. And what we need to do now is have a separate coverage for sexual misconduct. And that can either be on a claims-made policy or on an occurrence policy, which I don't want to really confuse people with that. But the important thing is, if you do the right risk management steps, which we'll talk in another one of our short seminars here, if you do the right steps, you want to buy as much sexual misconduct coverage as you can. I would still suggest a minimum limit of $300,000, but up to $1 million would be preferential. And to get that $1 million, you're going to have to do things like background checks and reference checks. And then an insurance company is more apt to give you a higher limit because you're taking the necessary steps.
Well, Jerry, I think it's important for church leaders to be familiar with exclusions under their insurance policy. In other words, risks that are not covered, they're excluded from coverage. You've mentioned sexual misconduct. Sometimes that is specifically excluded, but sometimes it's not. And in the latter case, there's an exclusion, as there is in all G&L policies, for intentional or criminal misconduct. And there have been so many cases where a church is sued for a case of child molestation by, let's say, a volunteer worker in the children's ministry. And the church turns the claim into the insurance company, and they'll deny coverage. They say, hey, that was an intentional or criminal act. And the church says, well, we didn't commit an intentional criminal act. We're being sued for negligence. So that exclusion doesn't apply to us. And I've read so many cases that have addressed that issue, and my general sense, it's about 50-50. About half the courts have said the intentional criminal misconduct exclusion applies, and the church is without coverage. But the other half of courts say, no, we agree with the church. They didn't do anything intentional. They're being sued for negligence. So the point is, it's very important for church leaders to clarify from their insurance company, what is your position? Do we have coverage for this? As we've seen in other presentations, the most significant, most frequent risk we face is child molestation. You need to know if you got coverage for that. Or is the insurance company going to argue that that's excluded under the intentional misconduct exclusion?
You gave one of the best reasons to be insured with a company that specifically writes churches, because you're absolutely correct. If you're with a company that does not specifically write churches, the interpretation is going to be more literal versus how they interpret it. One of the other things that you have to be aware of is if you have a sexual offender attending your church and you know it, or if somebody has previously had a sexual misconduct issue and you continue to allow them to stay at your church, if something happens again, most likely there will be an exclusion because you knew that there was an issue with this and you allowed it to happen.
Now, so that's one exclusion that we've talked about, the intentional misconduct exclusion. Another exclusion is for extraterritorial trips. How many churches send groups to other countries on short-term missions? It never even enters into their mind that there may be insurance coverage issues here. Talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, as you and I too well know, that if you're taking a missions trip to a foreign country and God forbid something happens in that foreign country and you are sued, most likely your present policy is not going to provide coverage for that because it happened in a foreign country. Most of the time, insurance companies under the general liability section cover bodily injury and property damage that occurred in the United States and or its U.S. territories. So we've had cases that have happened in foreign countries and there not be coverage. So it is very important that you have a foreign liability policy, or that if you're traveling with a denomination, maybe your denomination has a special policy that you can become a part of where you're getting foreign automobile and foreign general liability while you're in that foreign country.
One other exclusion I'd like you to comment on, again, it's in every insurance policy, GNL policy, and that is employment practices. The idea is that you've got workers' comp to cover employee injuries on the job, so you don't need insurance. And but many churches don't have workers' comp. They think they're exempt from it or something.
Let me stop there with work comp. So let's just talk about work comp. Who's the most important person operating at that church? The pastor. The church can't operate with the pastor. Workers' compensation is going to cover their medical bills if they get hurt while on the job, and cover them getting disability until they can get back on the job. It is a very small cost to insure for workers' compensation. I'm normally talking $200 a year to cover for workers' compensation, and we're covering you, the pastor. So I actually would tell a church, you need to buy workers' compensation because that's protecting the pastor, and that is a non-taxable benefit to them. So I just wanted to stop and add that in regards to work comp.
One other comment I would like to make is with regard to retention of church insurance policies. How long do you keep this massive document? After 5 years, can't we just throw them out?
Absolutely not. You and I have found out, unfortunately, this last week, we have a lawsuit and we're going back to the 1980s. If you do not have, it was a Child Molestation Act. If you do not have the policies to prove that you had the coverage back at that time, the insurance company is simply going to deny coverage because they have no proof. They keep their records for 7 years. Insurance agents will keep their records for 7 years. And what you got to realize is that it is up to you to prove that you had the coverage. So I tell people to permanently keep their insurance policies, especially when it comes to the general liability and umbrella, work comp, and automobile liability, because those are liabilities. Let's talk a little bit about, I want to mention 2 other items. One is pastoral counseling. If a church does pastoral counseling, which almost all of them do, you need to add pastoral counseling to your policy. A lot of companies do not automatically include that, so you need to include that in your policy. You need to make sure that you're not making a charge for that, because if you're making a charge for that, that makes you a professional counselor. You could run into some issues with that. Number one is that your insurance policy will exclude it because you're a paid counselor. Another policy that I want to talk about is directors and officers liability.
D&O.
D&O coverage. A lot of churches think, I'm a small church, but I have this board. But who is making up your board? Normally, it's your best givers at a small church. If something happens, those givers can be held personally responsible for what happens at that church. You don't want your largest givers being sued or not having protection for serving on your board. And that's where directors and officers liability comes in. I know that serving on a board of other nonprofits, that if they do not have directors and officers liability, I'm not serving on that board because I'm putting my personal assets at stake. So we want to make sure that that is happening.
Jerry, talk about vans and non-compliant cribs.
Okay. When we have, I will tell you, I prefer as a church planner that you stay away from 15-passenger vans. The main reason is the National Highway Department has proved that
National Highway Traffic Safety Administration
has proved that they're unsafe. And so there's automatic liability if you're operating one.
Many models are. They're trying to address that, and my understanding is some of them are probably safer now than they've been in the past.
They are because they have the anti-rollover and stuff like that. But I would tell people basically because of what's out there to stay away from 15-passenger vans, use a 12-passenger van. With cribs, the cribs have got to be before a certain year. Do you remember the year on that?
Well, that's the Consumer Product Safety Administration or Commission. They addressed this issue a number of years ago because of their realization that there were over 7 million non-compliant baby cribs in use in America, many of them in church nurseries. And so the last thing in the world you want to do is have a child die through asphyxiation because of a non-compliant crib. That what in the world are you keeping that thing for? So the Consumer Product Safety Commission's regulations prohibit not just the sale and distribution, but even the ownership and possession of these things. And so it's very important for churches, almost all of which have cribs in a nursery somewhere, to be sure that they are compliant. And you can go to the Consumer Product Safety Commission's website and look up your crib and see if it's a compliant crib or not. And if it's not, you've got to, you can't give it away or sell it. You got to destroy it, according to the commission.
Yeah, so you don't want to be accepting cribs.
That's right, unless you are determine that they are compliant.
For more information, you can go to agfinancial.org, go to the resource page, and you can download the Essentials of Church Insurance. This will give you a more thorough explanation of what the insurance is and defines the actual coverages that you may need.
Well, Jerry Sparks, thank you for that resource and for the information you have shared today that will be of vital significance to everyone engaged in a church planting ministry. Thank you again.
Thanks, Rich.